This is The Micro Effect.
The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You don't really understand sometimes what a terrible burden it is to know some of the things that I know. And try to wake people up and impart this knowledge to them. And find out that they just have walls built in front of them. They want to be slaves.
Now I risk sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but it's no longer a theory. What I'm about to say is fact. The secret organizations of the world power elite are no longer secret. They have planned and are now leading us into a one-world communist government.
Well, welcome to Connecting the Dots. This morning we have a special program on. Of course, every program we do is special, but we have a special program on today. And my guest today is Elizabeth Yore, and we will be doing a program on human trafficking, on child trafficking, and all the various, let's say, organizations around the world and around the country who have been part of a program that has tried to stop some of this child and human trafficking, and in fact, there are an equal number of organizations on the other side who are making the problem worse. And Elizabeth Yore is an attorney. She's a researcher. She's been on our program before. She talked about Pope Francis, and we'll have a little discussion at the end of the program today, talking about upcoming shows. But Liz is someone who has passionately dedicated her life to finding the causes and finding the solutions to end human and child trafficking around the world. And Liz, I welcome you to the show, and I would really love to have you give our listeners a little bit of history on your background, some of the things that you've been involved with, and then we'll get into the discussion that's going to take the next 2 hours to cover.
Great, Dan. It's a delight to be with you today and to talk with your listeners about human trafficking. My experience as a child advocate attorney really was one of many surprises that I found myself in this end of the legal practice. I was the general counsel at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is the National Clearinghouse for Missing Children, and headed up their international division and their cyber tip line, which reports all child pornography to law enforcement. I also was general counsel at the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, and that's where I became intimately aware of the relationship between children involved in foster care, wards of the state as they're called, and the problem of human trafficking. All this to my great shock. And finally, I was a special counsel to Oprah Winfrey. I handled some shows for her on child protection issues, and then I worked closely with her school in South Africa, her girls' school, the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls, on a major sex abuse case that originated at her school almost 7 months from the opening of the school back in 2007. So I've had a great deal of experience in human trafficking, child exploitation in international cases. And unfortunately, I have seen over the course of my career despite, a lot of effort and a lot of attention and a lot of money going to this issue, the problem of human trafficking is not only skyrocketing around the world, but sadly in these great United States. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the various forms of human trafficking, how we're seeing it in the United States, how the American people, who are law enforcement's greatest asset and resource, how your listening audience may be able to help to address this problem.
Well, that's wonderful. I have to tell you, I always look forward to the opportunity to have you as a guest on the show for any interaction. You're a fascinating lady. You've got such an incredible background in so much of the research that really today is so pointed and so necessary that we have these discussions. And I really look forward to the show because I know that we're going to uncover an awful lot of things here and discuss a lot of things that the lamestream media just does not cover, just does not really put the effort into. I mean, they may mention these things, but what we're going to do today is we are going to flesh these out in a way that every one of our listeners will fully understand and be incensed by the fact that so many of these problems not only have increased over recent years, but that some of the UN and some of these various agencies that are supposed to be part of the solution are actually some of the greatest promoters of this kind of craziness. So with that, Liz, would you kind of give us some definitions of what human and child trafficking is and really kind of outline what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. Human trafficking, according to the definition of the UN, is the recruitment, the transportation, the transfer, the harboring, or receipt of persons by improper means. And those improper means could be force, abduction, it could be fraud, it could be coercion. Fraud, for example, could be going up to a group of young women who are poor in a foreign country and saying, I can get you jobs in the United States where you will be paid X amount of money. And in fact, it turns out that is just a fraud to coerce them to come with them, and it ends up being a victim of human trafficking. And the purpose, the improper purpose of the abductions or coercions are either forced labor or sexual exploitation. And sex trafficking, according to the Department of Justice, is when a commercial sex act is induced by force, by fraud, or by coercion. And as a result, it oftentimes happens under the age of 18. And this recruitment and harboring oftentimes involves children. Sometimes women are the ones that are doing this recruitment. It's not necessarily men in gangs or what we call coyotes on the border or human smugglers. They oftentimes use men, women, whoever is available, because this is the thing, Dan. It is one of the most lucrative criminal enterprises known in the history of the world. As we know, guns and drugs, once they're sold, they're gone. But human beings can be sold again and again and again. And what they realize, the traffickers realize, is this human commodity is very lucrative for the trafficker and impoverishes the victim. So as a result, we're dealing with an enterprise that has begun to grow exponentially largely because victims are available and largely because it's so profitable. In fact, criminal enterprises that never got into sex trafficking or prostitution are now kind of dropping off their drugs and guns and going into sex trafficking. For example, the Taliban and ISIS. Some of the very Boko Haram abductions of young girls. The purpose is multi-purposes, but these girls have been involved by force into being suicide bombers, into being sexually trafficked, and as a result, we need to really be attentive to this growing criminal enterprise that has arrived full force on the shores of the United States.
Well, that certainly what you're talking about, and I've seen this happen over and over again in recent years, is UN agencies that are supposed to be, really monitoring this sort of thing with Islamic countries, with some of these areas. They're so afraid of offending someone that they actually end up maybe inadvertently promoting some of this human trafficking with whole nations and with whole cultures and with religions. And this is something that we're going to be talking about today. Liz, let's talk about some of the causes that you see that are really at the center of this. Now, you mentioned the fact that many of these young women will be told that they're going to get a job in the United States, they're going to do something that they're just trying to get out of a very, very bad situation in their home country. But let's talk about some of the causes, and I know that at the very center of these causes is this almost unlimited immigration that is happening all over the world, and almost all of it is undocumented.
Yes. The causes are, of course, poverty, vulnerable populations, and the causes, no matter what the causes are, and there's missing children, vulnerable families, at-risk children, are the populations that are often involved in sex trafficking. But, a very seldom mentioned phenomenon is the demand for illicit sex. And that's an issue that I think we need to have a conversation with. Human trafficking, sex trafficking wouldn't exist if there was no demand for it. If we didn't have, and that's from the very elite, which we can talk about, to the sex traffickers themselves exploiting these victims. So the demand for sex from vulnerable women and children is an issue that is integral to this phenomenon, and yet we're not talking about it at all. And what's driving that demand? I think we've seen over the course of many years, the cheapening of sex, the absolute exploitation on the internet, the huge rise in child pornography and the ability to access it at the click of a mouse. In the 1950s and 40s and before, it was a taboo to have pornography, right? And people could not even purchase it unless they went to some adult bookstore on the border of a state in a remote area. And even then, there was fear that they would be caught. Now, it's all in the secrecy and of people's bedrooms, of people's houses. And so as a result, it's that the cheap sex industry that's being driven and fed by pornography, child pornography. That's one disturbing piece. And this crime of sex trafficking and the abuse and use of women and children for sex crosses all borders, crosses all nationalities, crosses all economic boundaries. And so as a result, this is, an equal opportunity crime that we have to be absolutely honest in addressing, and also look at the demand for it. You brought up a brilliant point about the UN and, they're behind the sex trafficking initiatives, but you'll know that, for example, the UN peacekeeping troops, both in Haiti and in Africa, were found to have been raping vulnerable children and women. They ran child sex rings in Haiti. This is the UN peacekeeping troops. So, the very people that are supposed to be protecting vulnerable nations and situations, for example, the Haiti earthquake and tornadoes and tsunamis, those are oftentimes the people that are taking advantage of it. So, the extent, breadth, and depth of this problem is so enormous that it really does require the ability of all of us to really educate ourselves on it. And there's, by the way, there's lots of great YouTube videos and documentaries done about all the various child trafficking rings in various countries like Brazil and Thailand and Cambodia. And so there's the ability to know rather quickly the tactics, the vulnerabilities, and the places of where to look for human trafficking rings. So this is not going to be solved by government. It's going to be solved by, the small mom and pop operations, NGOs. It's going to be solved by a willingness of the public to say, this is a scourge in our country that must be ended. And unlike other crimes, this is, Dan, a covert crime. It's hidden in plain sight. So it is very difficult to uncover. And for that reason, law enforcement relies on the eyes and ears of the public. Dan, I've worked in missing kids cases for 20 years. Those cases were largely solved by the public. The public has that, which I love, their sixth sense, their gut instinct that something is wrong. Something just didn't seem right at that nail salon or that massage parlor, or for example, this great story about, I think it was a United Airlines flight attendant. She saw, I don't know if you're familiar with this story, but this is how one person using a little bit of creativity can save a life. She noticed that this young girl was with this man. She saw that this young girl was being silenced and controlled by this man. And she had been trained, the airlines are training flight attendants to look for human trafficking victims because we know that they come into all of our airports. And so what happened is she decided, what I'm going to do is give her lots of Cokes and soft drinks throughout the course of the flight. And so that she'll have to get up and go to the bathroom, leave her seat, leave him. And so when she saw this girl get up to go to the bathroom, she put a sign, a little Post-it note on the mirror in the bathroom in the airplane. And it said, "Do you need help?" And the girl wrote yes. And so what happened, she returned to her seat. The flight attendant went back into the bathroom, got the note, notified the captain, and when the plane landed at the airport, the FBI was there to meet the plane and to intervene, rescue this girl. In fact, she was being trafficked. Now, to me, every mom and dad says, yep, that makes a lot of sense. Was it high-tech criminal investigation tools? No. It was a Post-it note. It was using her feminine wiles, her maternal instincts. And so that's a great story of saving a life, using the resources that are available to you right in front of you. And because she was trained, because she was trained on to see that this girl averted her eyes, that she appeared to be in a controlled, domineering situation. All the bells and whistles went off. And so her job was to separate this girl from her abuser, from her trafficker, and verify that, in fact, what her gut was telling her was absolutely accurate. So that is, to me, a perfect example of how each one of us in our day-to-day life can intervene. It's to say a prayer, Lord, if you want me to save someone today, show me the way. And the other piece of this is, and that people often don't get the plaudits and the pat on the back. Our whole entire child welfare system, where children who are abused and neglected are intervened on by the government, that whole system is based on a hotline call from a next-door neighbor, from a relative, from oftentimes strangers, from teachers who say, I'm worried about this little girl. I never see her. She's starving. She appears to be disheveled, neglected. I don't see those children next door come out and play. There needs to be an investigation. Our whole system, in Illinois where I was, we at one point had, sadly to say, 50,000 children in state care, but largely driven by the care and concern of neighbors, friends, teachers. That's what makes our country great. It's what makes our country unique from the rest of the world, is that we believe that the value of children to be protected. Sometimes, protected from, parents. We saw those parents out in New Mexico. We believe that those children may need the intervention of a stranger. And so the same thing applies with this complex, covert, hidden criminal enterprise of human trafficking. It's not going to be solved by law enforcement. Law enforcement is distracted, busy in terrorism cases and violent crime cases. They need the eyes and ears of the public. So while we're talking about something that seems very exotic, it sounds like it's the topic of a Hollywood movie. It's in our neighborhoods, it's in our communities, in the rural, big cities, small towns, and so each person listening today can play a role to stop it and to save a life.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned something, Liz, that I think is important for our listeners to understand, and that is government will not be the solution to the problem. And in fact, our school system now is teaching all these different gender selections, and there's a sexualization of our whole culture that really has almost been promoted by government action. And this is an area that I think is causing an increase rather than a decrease in the human trafficking and the human bondage and in the use of prostitution and sexual trafficking. And this is something that I think is a social issue that our listeners and people need to solve, because we can't continue to create the sexualization that we have in the school systems and expect the children to not be affected by that. Am I off base in saying that?
No, you are absolutely right on point. And you know as well as I do, I've met moms and dads who have battled PTAs, battled teachers with respect to the sexualization of very young children. It's very subtle, but it's systematic. It's embedded in many of our schools. We've got to battle back. And because the unintended or possibly intended consequences of this massive sexualization of the culture is going to, have enormous consequences for generations to come. And these are the little but significant, and I don't personally think they're so little, because it's a tough road to hoe for parents to challenge early sex education. It's a challenge to the transgendering of our culture, and the normalization of radical sexualization in our culture. And the radicals have gone to the schools, they've gone to the media, they're embedded everywhere throughout the culture. So there are no safety nets except at home, right? There is no ability to intervene in these children's lives until and unless parents organize and use their voice, be willing to really lay down their lives and be called all sorts of names, but run for office, run for school board. These are the things that need to be done, because the sexualization, the propaganda machine is in place. We know it's in place in the television. Many people have just turned off the television. We know it's going on in the media, and we know it's certainly the internet has been largely fueled. I mean, the most profitable, most visited websites are porn sites. But we have to, as a society, recognize and reclaim innocence and purity as a value that we hold very dear for our children. Children cannot grow up free of all this garbage. And as people and law enforcement tell me, Liz, the stuff on the internet is not Playboy. As bad as Playboy was, these are violent, brutal videos of sexual exploitation of women and children of the worst form. And our little boys and little girls are getting access to this at very young ages, 8 years old. Can you imagine what that does organically to a child's brain, watching the violent sexual exploitation of numerous women? I mean, group sex, the homosexual sex. I mean, you name it, it's there at a click of a mouse. And so, and then they go to school, and are they taught reading, writing, and math? No. They spend all sorts of time sexualizing, brainwashing our children into the radical left agenda. So we got to roll up our sleeves and go to work, because what is driving human trafficking is the demand for illicit violent sex, cheap sex, right? And so it's no surprise that what's done through the internet, through schools, through violent sexual video games, all of this is feeding this monster criminal enterprise that has its tentacles in every community. And so it's a multi-pronged approach, isn't it? That we need to really address this on many levels, and not just say, human trafficking, well, it's not in my community. And, I was told by law enforcement in the city of Chicago that one of the busiest streets for both prostitution and human trafficking vision is right down the street from the Chicago Bulls Stadium. And, there will be, men driving down from the expensive, lush suburbs of Chicago, stopping on the street on their way to going to a Chicago Bulls game. I mean, that's very, very disturbing. And, but it's a reality that, we can't say, not in my house, not in my community. This happens in Thailand, not, in the suburbs of the big cities. The cops know differently. and we have to prosecute the Johns. We've got to prosecute them. We've got to, hopefully public shame will work by putting their names in the newspaper. But after working in this field for many years, I'm a believer in demand has to be addressed. For example, the Super Bowl. Why are we seeing human trafficking commercials in weeks, months before the Super Bowl and the Kentucky Derby and all the big sporting events? Because we know that traffickers are flooding the marketplace with their victims because they know that the demand is high for sex trafficking victims at these sports events. So that's a disturbing trend that we're seeing. As things evolve in law enforcement, we try and get ahead of that. But law enforcement is always traveling behind the criminal, and we have to always play catch up to uncover, dismantle, and disrupt human trafficking.
Right. Well, the whole perversion of our society has been something that's been really promoted by the left. It's been promoted by, the people that are, we refer to them as anti-Christians or humanists. They believe in, they don't believe in heaven and hell. They believe in whatever happens, and this is just the way it is. And, the culture has evolved into that sort of thinking, and I have to tell you, popped into my mind when you were talking about some of the leadership and the roles that they've taken in promoting this stuff. Certainly one of the things is Pizzagate, or the fact that Bill Clinton would fly down to a private Caribbean island with a known trafficker on his private jet to have sex with underage young women. This is the sort of thing that travels at the highest levels of our government, and if it's acceptable to society in general because of these people, we need to adjust our society. There's no question.
Yeah, the Jeffrey Epstein case, the Lolita Express, I think is what they called his private airplane. Bill Clinton was on it, 21 times? And the girls were recruited to Epstein's place in Palm Beach, trafficked around the world, by the way, went all over the world. And they were girls from well-to-do families, well-to-do area of Palm Beach, and actually a very fancy high school. And, I would really urge your listeners to read about the Jeffrey Epstein case. And I would venture to say that there are many Jeffrey Epsteins out there. For example, we know about politicians in New York, the Anthony Weiner and his sexting with underage girls. We now know about this NXIVM, that's NXIVM cult, where the leaders have just been arrested. And this cult was a sex trafficking cult. The victims were literally branded with the name of the cult leader, with the initials, I should say, of the cult leader. And all the facts of the NXIVM cult haven't begun. One of the heirs to the Bronfman liquor heiress was part of this cult. So it's, frankly, it's satanic, these cults. The abuse of children, the sacrificing of children, using human beings, branding them like cattle, like chattel. It's beyond the imagination. And, In the past we'd be, conspiracy theorists, right? Those things don't exist. And then law enforcement comes in and arrests these people. It's a reality that children are exploited, used, abused, sacrificed, and as we get further and further away from our faith, the founding fathers who acknowledged our reliance on God, as we take God, prayer out of the classroom, out of the stadium, out of the sports arena, out of our homes, of course this is going to happen. And it shouldn't really shock anybody because, without the being grounded in prayer and the protection that prayer gives our families, the evil one is prowling around the world, and so we see the things like Nexium cult. We see things like Jeffrey Epstein. We see the Tony Alama cult, the Warren Jeffs cult, the Waco, the Jim Jones. You go on and on and on. All of these guys sexually abused their cult members under the name of religion. So when we take God out of the equation and replace it with man as God, then man will defile the human body, will defile humanity. It's just the nature of human activity, unfortunately. And so it's, to me, for example, the law enforcement is, and I just came back from a major crimes against children conference in Dallas. They have over 5,000 law enforcement there. And, one of the interesting things that they were talking about is that there are about 843,000 registered sex offenders in the United States, but over 50,000 of them are non-compliant. And which means they're not where they say they are. That number's probably a lot higher. And this is the other thing people have to realize, is that by going on, every state has a sex offender registry. Oftentimes, those are human traffickers who are listed. It's the dumb ones that get caught, first and foremost. The clever ones seldom get caught. And we also know that only about 5 to 8% of children disclose about abuse. And of that percentage, many wait 10, 20, 30 years to disclose. So we're in a position where if we have children that disclose, that's a rarity. Oftentimes children don't have the words to describe the sexual abuse. And with human trafficking victims, they're not only abused repeatedly, but they are so traumatized and so isolated, and oftentimes don't have the ability to even speak our language, so that we know that it's very difficult to prosecute these cases. So we can have a lot of arrests, but it's rare. It's rare that we have prosecutions equal to the number of arrests. For example, there are, and this is in 2014, so we weren't even in the height of the migration crisis, Dan. We had 52,000 unaccompanied children cross the border, the Mexican border. Most of them were from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And we know that there has been a 92% increase in those numbers. So it's, what is extremely difficult is that, we have both them coming into our airports and then flooding our borders. And about the statistics from our government is that about 80% of the women and children who are coming through Mexico to cross our borders illegally, 80% of them are raped in the process of traveling to the border. So human trafficking is, we know it's lucrative. We know that if poor women cannot afford a coyote, that they use, sex in order to accompany them to the border. And this is why, we need to have the discussion about securing our borders. Because, when they talk about drugs, when they talk about human trafficking, that is a reality that our ICE and Border Patrol are, trying to deal with, not only just the numbers, but the results of the crimes that these traumatized victims bring with them when they come into our country illegally. So, it's just an enormous problem that does not have any initial resolution because it's growing so fast for law enforcement.
Right. Well, you brought up something that I really wanted to get into in some detail, and I know you're the person that can do that, and that is all this illegal immigration and migration of entire populations literally into Europe, into the United States, and the globalists want a virtually uncontrolled, no borders, uncontrolled migration that can go wherever it wants, and that has been kind of at the core of so much of this human trafficking, because when you've got that kind of just open-ended immigration, there's going to be people that are going to exploit that. And you talked about the coyotes and the the fact that there are groups literally all over the world that are making a very good living in moving people in and out of countries illegally. So let's talk about that and how, I know you're a big promoter of ICE and you're a promoter of President Trump's plans to try to reduce the amount of illegal immigration and the prosecution of people who are criminals who are part of this human trafficking. So great segue into that. Let's talk about that.
Sure. I mean, the Department of State and Health and Human Services says that 1 of every 4 kids coming across the United States are brought here by human trafficking rings. I mean, that's a fact. They interview these kids. They arrest these human traffickers, these coyotes. So we know the destabilizing impact that this has on our communities, on our society. And the interesting thing is that many of these, whether they're coming in across the southern border or elsewhere, that many of them are being placed in rural communities that do not have a law enforcement structure, so that they're able to move quickly around the country without the eyes and ears of law enforcement to intervene on them. And so that is a reality that nobody wants to talk about, that you only hear, oh, these poor unaccompanied minor children. It's true, but an open, porous border has caused them to be exploited by the worst of the worst. And that's why having a border wall built would immediately reduce the numbers to a dribble. Immediately. And, and we are feeding, open borders feed human trafficking rings and enterprises. It's a $150 billion industry. These guys are making hundreds of thousands of dollars, and, guns and drugs are sold and gone. Human beings, as I said, have been able to be repeatedly sold, and you make money off of these children. And there should be no other discussion except that drugs and human trafficking would end dramatically or be reduced dramatically with the border wall. And that's because what we see in our communities and what law enforcement has seen is this huge explosion in every state and in every community of human trafficking. And it's being driven by this onslaught that we have had on the southern border. Here's some estimates that 150 unaccompanied minors will be coming into the United States in 2015 and 2016. I mean, that to me is shocking that we're trying to deal. And keep in mind that this is hidden, this is covert. We're not capturing any significant amounts of people that are coming across the border for this purpose. And we have several human trafficking laws on the books, but the problem is that we're being overwhelmed at the border, and really President Trump's only solution is this border wall, which will stop the flow, both of drugs as well as human trafficking. Now, when was the last time you heard that discussion go on in the media? They don't want to have it. They just refuse to have it. And when we see the fentanyl crisis, the opioid crisis, we see the cocaine, the heroin pouring into our country. That's porous borders, and whether it's at the airport, whether it's at the ports, whether it's at our southern border. And ICE is making the most valiant effort to intervene, to educate the public, to try and figure out all sorts of ways to protect the borders until the wall is built. And we can only come up with so many solutions. That we know from other countries that have built walls that they do protect the citizens. And ultimately, the responsibility of both the president as well as law enforcement officials, as well as public servants, is to protect. The ultimate responsibility is to protect people, the citizens of this country. And how many Kate Steinleys, how many Molly Tibbetts, how many other names we don't know have been unnecessarily killed because of porous borders. And I will tell you, in studying Europe and studying what's going on in the no-go zones and the chaos of unrestricted migration, Europe is Europe no more. It is unrecognizable. With they have for example 85 Sharia courts in England. I mean, we see common law is from England. We are seeing human trafficking in Europe has exploded because of this increase in this unrestricted massive increase in victims, refugees, quote-unquote refugees, coming from the Middle East. And this is the whole purpose of the New World Order.
Right.
To have mass migration, both in the United States as well as Europe, is to destabilize our capitalist, democratic, representative government.
Absolutely.
To bring chaos to the streets. And then the New World Order steps in with its tyrannical imposition of rules, regulations, taking away our rights, taking away our powers. as human beings. And look at look at Europe. They are in a death struggle with this problem, and it's frankly it's the Soros agenda. George Soros has this whole migration, both in the United States as well as Europe, is a very strategic play of the New World Order to take control of all these what used to be sovereign governments. That if you take away the sovereignty of a government, then you take away their ability to protect their people, to set up laws that will guard their borders, to set up sane and rational immigration policies. Then the people in the midst of the chaos and melting down of civilized societies, where do they turn? They have nowhere else to turn, and then the New World Order steps in and imposes a New World Order. And that's what's happening right now in Europe. They've been largely successful. There's those pockets of places like Hungary and now Italy, Brexit in England, in Britain. But I think the damage has been done. We have seen from law enforcement that sex trafficking is out of control, and so as a result, and they're not tracking these people. In the old days, if you went to Europe and lived in Europe, you would have to, and weren't a citizen of Europe, you would have to register every 6 months. If you were a student over there, you'd have to go in and make sure, yes, I'm still enrolled in the school, and they kept track of you. Those days are long gone. But the purpose of it was to monitor foreigners in the country and to ensure that they're there for their stated purpose and to ensure that they weren't engaged in criminal activity. There are rational reasons behind immigration policies, and that's all been turned out the window. We have the globalist EU, and the purpose of the EU is to impose regulations, rules, laws on all these countries, and there's no accountability. All the officials and commissioners in the European Union are appointed. They're not elected by the people. So as a result, the people have lost their power to redress grievances. And that is the purpose of a representative government, whether it's facing with an onslaught of human trafficking or drugs. It is to speak up and say, or going into your local communities and schools and saying, I don't want my child to be taught this garbage, or be forced to read history books that are, fake news, that are rewriting history from, a radical point of view. But that is all these little pieces of the New World Order agenda are in place and, frankly, are happening as we speak.
Right. No, Liz, that's the important thing that I think people need to realize. We've been trying to reinforce for the last month and a half on this radio program is that we are facing a all-out assault by the New World Order, by the globalists who want to move forward with a world government controlled by communists that promotes a system that is totally the opposite of what our constitutional Republican form of government is all about. And they've been putting all these pieces in place, including the elected officials, the so-called progressives, who incidentally are progressive socialists or communists outright, that are in our Congress, that are have been in the highest offices in our land, and now we're facing an entire cultural onslaught through immigration, through human trafficking, all the things that are going on right now. None of this is, let's say, just an accident or bad policy that just went awry. It is being planned, and it's being planned to literally destroy our society, our traditional Western culture and society, and that's based on the Christian beliefs and the Christian church. Those things are being assaulted openly by globalists all over the world, and it's time that America wakes up and understands that we're out of time. If we don't start moving forward and stopping some of this stuff, we are going to see things happen that are going to happen so fast we won't be able to react. And certainly President Trump, in my belief, the reason that the New World Order and the globalists are so adamantly against everything that he is doing and trying to destroy him personally is because he's not part of that clique. He is an outsider, he's a populist, and he came into the system from totally outside the system, and they didn't expect him to get elected. They were sure that Hillary would be the one, and they thought the whole plan was 100% in place and everything was going to work. And now that he's trying to do things like increase enforcement on the borders, put up the border wall, things that stop this globalist agenda, he is facing some of the fiercest opposition that you could possibly imagine, and the American people need to wake up and support this man, and let's stop this together. If we don't do it, no one else can.
You know, Dan, you're absolutely correct. I've seen, from my perspective, the ramping up of the federal law enforcement, specifically ICE, Homeland Security, Border Patrol, Border Control, and they have been given a free rein by this administration to end human trafficking, to take control back from the border. And as a result, we see huge efforts going on right now.
Liz, we've got the break coming up. Pick it up on the other side of the break.
This is The Micro Effect.
The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls the string. It makes his little puppets dance to every song he sings as the night rolls in on a rising tide.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today our guest is attorney and internationally recognized expert on child trafficking and human trafficking, and her name is Elizabeth Yore, and Liz is a dedicated professional that has spent literally her whole work life trying to stop some of these very, very tragic problems from taking over our society. Before we get back into the discussion, I want to remind our listeners to listen to Debbie Boscalupi's Radioactive Wednesday tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Pacific time. She has a program that is fantastic. We often coordinate our programs together so that we are discussing many of the same subjects by different guests. And so we work together to make those programs really, really interesting and a continuing education program. Also, I want to mention that Jeff Bennett's Life, Liberty, and all that jazz is on immediately after our programs from Tuesday through Friday. And he has a terrific program that folks need to tune in. There's a lot of common sense being said and being delivered on this network, and as a result of that, I have to tell our listeners, please support this radio network, support our sponsors, and consider donating some money to the cause. We are in the process of delivering a satellite uplink service to our listeners nationwide and throughout all of North America, and we cannot do that without your support. So please support this network and allow us to deliver the truth to millions and millions of people who need to hear what's really happening in the world. Liz, I'm sorry we had to cut you short for the commercial break, but we were talking about the borderless situation that we have and how President Trump's programs and ICE are really trying to nip that in the bud. And I have to tell our listeners, one of the number one priorities of globalism is to destroy national borders so that we can destroy society and rule of law and create the kind of anarchy and the kind of chaos that will allow a world dictatorship, a world government based on the Marxist communist model to take over our entire culture. So anyway, with that, Liz, please come back into the conversation and let's talk about what the president is working on and how important it is that we keep ICE in place and strengthen their role in stopping this human trafficking.
Oh, yes. Wouldn't the globalists love to eliminate ICE, right? Abolish ICE. Oh, would they love it? Yes, then their goals would be fast-forwarded, and, this is, but I think, the public is on to this. They get it. Even apparently the latest poll of the Democrats, they didn't believe in pushing this abolish ICE mantra. And, I think people need to understand, you and I, Jan, because we're in this kind of business of watching the media, watching the left, these organizations, these themes of abolish ICE, they don't just organically bubble up, right? They are strategic and planned and messaged throughout the continuum of the left organization. So when you hear abolish ICE, kind of this drumbeat that's coming from the left media, it's very strategic and planned. Now, with respect to President Trump, one of his first executive orders was to address human trafficking and to address the human trafficking criminal organizations that are behind this horrendous enterprise. And what's interesting, he understands that if you follow the money, if you seize the money and the assets of these criminal organizations, you can freeze them out. You can bankrupt them. And he, through this executive order, which I think is very powerful because it says, I'm not going to wait for this law to kind of work its way for months and possibly years through the Congress. I'm going to set down through my executive order powers the ability to seize the assets immediately of these criminal organizations that are behind human trafficking. The sobering issues and facts that people need to realize. We hear about, the unaccompanied children that are going across the border, and the sad sob stories of that they're separated from their so-called parents, and how cruel ICE is. 90% of the unaccompanied children that cross the border never show up for their court appointment, to determine whether or not they are fleeing an alien or asylum-based standard of whether or not they're judged to be able to stay in this country legally. They're gone. Oftentimes they're gone into the hands of the human trafficker. So there is no respect for our laws and our rules and the system that's been put in place to capture people who cross the border illegally. So that that's the great frustration. That Trump has people mock the border wall, and say, oh my gosh, a border wall. Oh, how pedestrian to do such a thing. But clearly, if you know what's going on beyond the border, you know that there is no ability to stop or stem this tsunami of violators across our border because they don't show up. They don't submit to the immigration laws. They're gone into the fabric of our society, creating havoc, for example, in the sense of, the victims like Kate Steinle and Molly Tibbetts, or they become victims in human trafficking. And, or they, are, we know the statistics from, the prison guards and the Bureau of Prisons, a huge number of illegal aliens that are in the prisons, a huge number of illegal aliens that are on federal welfare. This is a problem that is only going to be solved by a border wall. And therefore, anything that we can do with our voice, with our feet, with voting, to ensure that the border wall gets built, we need to do. And because, the processes that are in place to capture these illegal immigrants, illegal aliens that are crossing the border are virtually, first of all, anybody who would show up, it's a huge number of people. We don't have enough judges to address this issue, but very few actually show up to be adjudicated in our court system. So what is also very troubling is this total lack of respect, as you point out, Dan, for the rule of law. And whether it's immigration law, whether it's traffic laws, whether it's voting laws, we have the rule of law in place in our country and have spent a great deal of money and resources to ensure that our laws are protected by citizens and by people living in this country legally. That to see that just tossed aside, not only by human traffickers, but by those that have crossed our border, that has a deleterious effect on the country as a whole, on a continuing disrespect for our law by both citizens as well as non-citizens. And so I would really urge people to really, if you can in any way, to send out a message to your representatives that you want the border wall built. I mean, that would be a huge incentive to continue to have the voices of Americans speak loudly and clearly to Democrats and Republicans, and especially, where our representatives are always turning over and going to the ballot box. So they need to be especially attuned to our voices. And so, we understand in this country that one person can make a difference. We see this, and I think I may have said it before, in the John Walsh, whose son was abducted and murdered. We have countless laws named after Adam Walsh because of the advocacy of his father to protect missing children. That doesn't exist anywhere in the world.
Right.
The Amber Alert is because Amber Hageman was abducted and killed, and her mother realized that had the description of the abductor's car and his license plate been blasted through the media, on electronic highway billboards, in the radio, that the public would have been able to capture her before she was killed. Stop this, guys. So it's individuals. Kate Steinle's family is battling mightily for Kate's Law. It's Megan's Law after Megan Kanka. So it's, let's not have to have the victims of crimes be the heroes in this. Let's see if we can prevent these crimes from happening. One of the examples of, we have about 450,000 runaways in the United States. These children are children from, dysfunctional families, many of these children running away from foster care, from group homes. These are extremely vulnerable children. And many of these children are becoming victims of human trafficking. They have no other way to support themselves. They are traumatized anyway because they oftentimes came into a system because they were abused and neglected. 450,000 runaways is a national shame. But that number actually, Dan, stays very consistent year after year. Many of these kids are endangered runaways, meaning, they're addicted to drugs, they have medical conditions, mental health issues. And when I was at DCFS as their general counsel, I immediately realized that we were not tracking our children who were in care and who had gone missing. Can you imagine? We are guardian of these children, and we are their parents under state law. And many of them had gone missing, and we didn't know where they were. We hadn't reported them to law enforcement, and we just called them, oh, she's a runner. She's a runner. And that would be the notation in the case notes. Can you imagine, as parents, if our kids went missing, we would be on the phone to the police. We'd be making posters. We would be calling everybody to start searching. But that isn't being done in the child welfare system. So we immediately imposed a system where we started looking for these children, finding out where they were, recovering them. And as a result, Dan, I uncovered that our kids in DCFS care, some of our kids were involved in human trafficking. To my horror, I learned this. And these were girls that were on the run. Oftentimes they would come back to the shelter that we ran, for 3 square meals and a shower, but then they would take off again and go back to their pimp, their trafficker. And as a result of a partnership that I had with the FBI in Chicago, we began really trying to intervene in these girls' lives, get them off the street, separate them from their pimps. And it was a gargantuan effort. even with the power of the federal government, and even with the resources of state government. And now I understand why it's so difficult to have, prosecutions are just inordinately low because it's just a very, very difficult case to prosecute. So as a result of this case, and this is really, it's an intrigue, we kept on working closely with the FBI, who was on the streets of Chicago night after night, trying to find these girls, trying to, take pictures of the traffickers, of the pimps, looking for the locations where these poor girls were being exploited and prostituted. And every time the girls, these two particular girls, went back to our DCFS shelter, Dan, I would call the FBI. It could have been 3 in the morning when I was alerted that these girls were at the shelter. And we had a female FBI agent. If it's 3 in the morning, she'd drive to the shelter and try and establish a relationship, a trust, and to talk to these girls about not going back on the street, that we would protect them, that we would care for them. And slowly but surely, the girls would spend less and less time on the street and more time in the shelter. I mean, it's very discouraging as a prosecutor, as somebody who's in child advocacy, to be trying to intervene in girls' lives and then realize, they're going back to be a monster. And these girls were being beaten, they were being starved, they never saw the money that they made, and their pimps were making approximately $250,000 a year on these girls each. And what we learned, what the FBI agents told as they talked to these girls, were being trafficked around the world. So they finally agreed to go into protective custody. We took them out of Chicago up to the border of Illinois and Wisconsin, hid them there. These girls testified before the federal grand jury. Now, Dan, federal grand juries are listening to bank robberies, political corruption in Chicago. They listen to crimes of, terrorism, but rarely do they hear the testimony of 2 underage girls, 15 and 16, testify about life on the street, about how they were trafficked around the world. And there wasn't a dry eye in that grand jury room. And you can imagine the bravery and the courage of these girls as they told just horrible stories. And so as a result, their traffickers were indicted by the federal grand jury. And because they had money, they did not flee. They went to trial, which meant that these girls had to testify in front of a jury, in front of their traffickers, in order to put these guys away. Well, they did bravely testify. These guys were, and these girls were, like the NXIVM cult, branded with a tattoo that on their shoulders that said the name of their pimp. And as a result, these guys got 19, because the federal laws are pretty onerous and tough and longer than the sentencing for the state laws. They got 19 years and 31 years. And these little girls, teens, were able to really rebuild their lives. And as a result, they have been able to, get all sorts of resources to, try and put the trauma behind them. Now, they'll never be able to fully recover after a life on the street, a young life on the streets and the brutality that they endured. They have obviously issues of trust, but they're free. And that's what sex trafficking does. It enslaves its victims. But these girls are now free. And with each passing day, they trust a little more. They realize that there's not going to be that knock on their door. But to your listeners, it was because we had some CASA volunteers as court-appointed special advocates who opened up their homes, loved these girls, kept them safe, protected them, that we were able to have convictions against these guys. And they were the first federal prosecutions and convictions under the Human Trafficking Act. But that story, I think, is instructive on many, many levels. The number of people that had to be, engaged and put to work to save these two young girls' lives. I have no doubt that they would have been killed sooner or later, or else die of some horrible disease at a very young age. But giving vulnerable children who had spent their life in the child welfare system the power of the U.S. federal government to save them. I mean, that to me is one of those moments, of really kind of just high spiritual moment of, there is goodness in the world, and the federal government can, with the right people, save lives. And it was a confluence of, many people all on the same page, all determined to rescue these girls. And it was through lives. It wasn't a score of girls. It was 2 lives. So that, I think, is instructive on a lot of levels, in the sense that kids in the welfare system go missing and end up in human trafficking. We know that of the victims in I think it was L.A. County, in California, where there was a study of sex trafficking, we know that over 60% of the victims had been involved in the foster care system. I think it's probably even higher than that, but we know in just L.A. County that number existed. So kids that go missing, for example, Walmart's been great about having pictures of endangered runaways and missing. Look at those pictures when you go to Walmart as you're leaving, with your cart full of goodies. Look at those pictures in Sam's Club and look at those faces. You never know if it's a child who has crossed your path. And so, the vast majority of children who are missing are found by, the public. And because of leads, because I know that face. Some people, I don't have this ability, but some people have the ability never to forget a face. And I've learned in missing kids cases that oftentimes it's kids who remember kids' faces too. So it's a huge number. It's almost 500,000 kids in the United States that go missing. That's our pool of American children that are at risk in human trafficking. So there's a lot of work to be done. I would say to those people that are listening and really want to do something, think about being a foster parent. I'll tell you, Dan, we need good foster parents. The system does not have an abundance of good foster parents. Some, certainly not all, but some of the people are just in the business of foster parenting for the money. One of the hardest things that I did is, seeing reports on foster parents who would lock the refrigerator and not let the children open the refrigerator, foster parents who sexually and physically abused children who had been pulled from their parents because they were physically and sexually abused, and then we place them with people who don't care. And so,
Liz, we've got a commercial break coming up, but we'll pick this up on the other side of the break, and I want to get into, this is Stockholm Syndrome that you were talking about, these young ladies. We'll talk about Stockholm Syndrome, and then we'll talk about China's one-child policy on the other side of the break.
Great.
This is the Micro Effect.
The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from...
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today my guest on the radio show is Elizabeth Yore. Liz is an attorney and a researcher that has spent much of her professional career exposing the tragic world of child pornography, human trafficking, and missing children. And she's done a number of other exposés, and we'll talk about that as we get a little closer to the end of the program. But Liz is also working on the subject of clergy abuse, and we'll talk about that toward the end of the show. But this lady does more research and has a deeper understanding of these issues than anyone in the country, and she is very, very well recognized around the world as one of the very top, if not top, expert on this subject of human trafficking. So we're really honored to have Liz as a guest on our show today. And her information is absolutely impeccable. We need to understand that she comes from a very, very traditional perspective of family, of religion, many things, but at the same time, she has been part of a worldwide program to expose the players, the actors that are behind this tragedy in our culture, and we need to end this. And Liz, you're a great spokesman for the movement to stop this. Before we get back into the discussion, I do want to remind our listeners, please listen to Debbie Boscaluppi's Radioactive Wednesday tomorrow morning at the same time as my show on Wednesday. And Jeff Bennett, Life, Liberty, and all that jazz, which is after our programs, Tuesday through Friday. And please support this radio network. Support the work that we are doing, because we cannot expand our listeners. We cannot do the work that we're doing without the support of many people, many listeners. Literally $5 a month if you can afford to do that. And please go to our websites and donate and help us with this cause, because we are doing this to save our country and to save the world and stand up as a, let's say, a line of communication to stop the New World Order. So with that, Liz, getting back into the discussion, we were talking about what is called Stockholm Syndrome, which is, young people who are look up to their abductors, and it's just kind of a human, I guess it's a human frailty that sometimes people get so used to the abuse and so used to this tragic situation that they become kind of, I guess you'd have to say, emotionally tied to the people that are abusing them. And this is a really sad statement, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit. And then I want to move on, because we're going to be running out of time. I want to move on to the China's one-child policy as we get past some of the Stockholm Syndrome. Talk about one-child policy in China and what a tragedy that's been for human trafficking worldwide as well. So anyway, please take over from there.
Sure. The Stockholm Syndrome is that the victim identifies with the perpetrator. The causes, of course, are the fragility of the human psyche when it's subjected to trauma. Many of these victims have been isolated, denied all sorts of freedom, become totally, and are told they're totally dependent for their survival on their perpetrator, on their passport, their identity papers, their ability to eat, to live, to breathe, to have water, to sleep is all dependent on their perpetrator, who also, on the other hand, continues to abuse them sexually and sell them for great profit. So as a result, it's a survival mode mechanism that is used to endure what is obviously just a tremendous amount of abuse and to be able to survive it. So as a result, we saw this with Elizabeth Smart when she was initially picked up by the police and she was with her perpetrator, her abductor. She identified with the abductor. We saw Patty Hearst was another example of where after a period of time where she was abducted and indoctrinated and totally reliant for survival on her abductors, that she identified with them and even showed up at, robbery of a bank. And so it's oftentimes hard for people to understand the trauma that these victims go for, but that's the nature of the Stockholm Syndrome, and it's also a survival. This is, people, our basic instinct is, I got to survive. I can't die. I got to rely on somebody. There's nobody else but this guy. So I'll identify with him. I'll do whatever he says I should do. They won't run away. They don't have to be locked up in a room. They will be free to come and go. We've seen this with a lot of kidnapping victims, and over the course where after 2 or 3 years, they're not locked up in a closet by their abductor. They're free to go to the store and get food, and they don't say anything, and they return to their abductor. So that's the psychological stress and the psychological phenomenon of the Stockholm Syndrome. And what I would say to you is that is the importance of having a strategy to intervene with these victims, to build trust, and to separate them from their abductor. But it's a reality that those of us in law enforcement and those of us who've dealt with children who've been traumatized have to deal with. With respect to the unintended consequences, although obvious consequences of the China one-child policy, which was put into place in, I think it was about 1978, is as a result, when you interfere with God's plan, natural plan, there is an imbalance and a disorder that comes into the population, and we have that in China. What we now see is that for every 150 boys that are born in China, and there's a preference for a male, there are 100 girls that were born. And so immediately there becomes a growing imbalance of the ratio of boys to girls. In most populations without interference, without a gender side or a sex selection or infanticide, as it's called, because many in China have had abortions because they knew that they were having a girl and they wanted a son, because the son is, the primogenitor to carry on the name. And as a result of these government-forced policies, there has been a huge imbalance. It's obvious. Approximately, we don't know for sure, but 60 million, maybe more, missing women, they're called, as a result, direct result of the China one-child policy. It's now, of course, become very obvious as a result of that there is a huge societal consequence of their governmental policy. That's a result of massive sex trafficking into China because there are no women for the men, far fewer women. There is a huge STD problem because of the sexual exploitation of trafficked women into China, and China is dealing with, surprise, surprise, a huge HIV problem as a result of this government-enforced gender imbalance that has, just visited shores and has wreaked havoc in China. And, the abortion policy of China, which has been, the forced abortion, the forced sterilization, has been just a nightmare of societal problems, far greater than, what the Chinese officials could have said of, overpopulation as a result. Interestingly, North Korea also is very much on the front of, the world stage. 80% of North Koreans who escape into China are women. And 9 out of 10 of these women become victims of human trafficking. And if they are deported back to North Korea, they're largely thrown in jail or executed. So we see that China's governmental policy of one child has created not just in China chaos, but it has created and fueled sex trafficking in all of Asia. So that driven by the demand for women in China, women are being trafficked into China from all countries in Asia. And so we see it's, Dan, it's obvious to anybody. Any demographer would tell you, well, of course that's going to happen. But over the course of, since 1978, chaos has happened in China, and it's a demographic suicidal nightmare that's occurring in China. Now, we recently saw, and demographers are telling us, it's as a direct result of the one-child policy in China and all the societal, sociological problems that are occurring because of that, to say nothing of the massive abortion, sterilization agenda in China. We've now seen supposedly China lifting their one-child policy. Some have said it's very directed at certain cantons in China, that it's not overall. Some say it's just a PR fiction, fake news that's being generated. I don't know. I'm not on the ground in China. But they've been forced to address this issue in China. And it's, Dan, when you play with Mother Nature, when you try and manipulate Mother Nature, there are consequences that are going to be devastating to society. And those consequences will remain in society for generation after generation after generation. But the good news is that, the public can become, that second level, that safety level of protecting human trafficking victims. One interesting thing, if there's any law enforcement people listening to the call, at my conference, we're making a big push for law enforcement when they make a traffic stop to start looking for human trafficking victims. The research now, Dan, is showing that human trafficking victims who are traveling by car were stopped sometimes up to 3 or 4 times for traffic violations, and the law enforcement never intervened and realized that there were human trafficking victims in those cars at those traffic stops. So it's an ability for law enforcement, and there's training that's going on to what are the things to look for, how to separate children who are in the car to talk to them. But we know that human trafficking victims are being transported not only in planes, in trains, but also through cars. So that's a heads up for anybody in law enforcement, and certainly you can reach out to me. I'll put you in touch with the free training that's going on. One more before we go, exciting new initiative that actually started in Europe as a result of human trafficking is There's training, and it's been very successful in these pilot projects at the airports. They're telling in schools and NGOs and through the media, telling victims of human trafficking who are traveling through airports to grab a spoon and put the spoon in their underwear. And the transportation agents, the Homeland Security, the TSA in the European airports are able to spot the spoon in the magnetometer and separate these victims and talk to them and get them away from their traffickers. So this, what we're calling the spoon campaign, we know has been extremely successful in Europe, rescuing hundreds of girls. It's being transplanted in Britain, at Britain airports. So we're hoping to bring it here to the United States as well. A simple thing, isn't it? Grab a spoon. It's going to be spotted on the magnetometer. It allows law enforcement to spot it immediately as a potential victim of human trafficking or some other crime. For example, lots of other crimes that girls are coming through and being able to be rescued by law enforcement. These are prevention activities that, the public can figure out. So if the public has ideas like that, I think they need to share them with law enforcement, because it's oftentimes the simple thing that you kind of knock your head and go, why didn't I think of that? Like the Amber Alert, it costs any extra money, but it's using resources that we have available to us to intervene, to save lives, to rescue kind of that hidden crime that seems so difficult to find, to spot. Even the simplest things are there for us to use.
Well, and Elizabeth, the comments that you've made throughout this show, what we really understand is that the cause for much of this human trafficking, there's several reasons for it, obviously, and you've discussed quite a few of them. One is government intervention in a negative way, like in China with their one-child policy, and areas where internationalists have promoted some really, really crazy programs that have actually helped to accelerate the human trafficking. But also what we need to do as a society is to recognize that much of what's happening in the world with human trafficking is a result of a societal breakdown, of a lack of Christian education, a lack of traditional, and you don't have to be a Christian, but certainly a lack of traditional American values. And that's something that has been promoted by the globalists to the detriment of our whole society. And we need to understand that, and that's one way we can fight back, is to let our elected officials know that we've had enough of this crazy stuff and start getting involved. You mentioned getting elected to public office, get elected to school boards, be involved. The American people have allowed a lot of this to happen to them because they have not been involved enough in the decision-making process and in the education of their children. And it's very important that our listeners understand we are the solution. Individuals are the solution to this problem, and we need to support our traditional American values. Is that a fair statement, Liz?
That's brilliantly said, Dan. And I would, if there are any people who know victims of human trafficking, if these victims text BEFREE, BEFREE, text, and the number is 233-733. There's help available. That goes to the Polaris hotline trafficking network that will rescue victims, or the National Human Trafficking Hotline, 1-888-373-6000. 7888. Yes, families are the key to a thriving and safe and protected society, healthy families. And to get involved and to show your kids that, being involved as a concerned citizen and fighting for the rule of law and fighting for Christian values is what made this country exceptional and great. And Dan, I couldn't have said it better myself. You've hit on the real cause and the real need for everybody to get involved.
They do. And incidentally, we're going to give that website and telephone number out again before we end the show. So, folks, if you have a pen or pencil handy, it's in the other room. Run and get it, because we will do the website and the telephone number again before the end of the program. Okay, now let's talk about, and this is something that you and I talked about offline before the show, and that is the work that you are doing right now in the subject of clergy abuse. And tell our listeners, because we will be talking about this in another show in the very near future, and I want to leave that little tickler out there because I know you've done a tremendous amount of work in that field.
Well, speaking of human trafficking, Dan, I attended the Pope's first human trafficking conference in November of 2013, and my eyes were opened into what you and I originally were talking about is the New World Order, and how using things like human trafficking to really push the agenda of the New World Order. As a result, I was originally involved in a number of clergy abuse cases in Chicago. So I was extremely concerned that children are protected in not only school settings but religious settings, and have been doing quite a bit of work in examining what's going on in the Vatican. I feel very strongly that this Pope certainly has been pushing the New World Agenda order. It's been very strategic. He has many of Soros's acolytes at the Vatican working on climate change and other issues. And it's very distressing to see something like human trafficking not being effectively addressed, but rather being used to promote the New World Agenda order. So it's all involved in the exploitation of children, right? We've seen that. We see that in screaming headlines in the last few weeks. And what happens as a result of that is that people leave the church. What happens to that is victims get angry at God. And so the agenda of the New World Order is achieved, isn't it? With priests, bishops, and cardinals abusing children. It destroys families, and it sends people as far away from their faith as possible. And that's what's deeply troubling to me, the injury, the physical and emotional injury to children, as well as you rob them of their innocence, and they have been robbed of their faith. And they view their perpetrator as God doing this to them. And I can't imagine any more heinous abuse of children than that. Yes, I'm knee-deep in investigating, speaking, reading, researching about this issue, and we'll welcome the opportunity to talk about it.
Well, we'll do that in a future show, and I know that one of the things that we talked about when you did the program on Pope Francis is that when you went to that conference on children, you really got an eye-opening look at what Pope Francis is all about, and it really changed your life and the way you perceived the Vatican and the papacy in in the New World Order. And also, I want to mention that you are a very devout Catholic and write for a Catholic newspaper on a regular basis. Would you just mention that?
Sure. I write for The Remnant. I also write for LifeSite News, and as difficult as this subject is, and my ability to investigate priests that abuse children, I try and, from a perspective of a practicing Catholic, urge people not to lose their faith, and try
get
and
involved.
Get involved.
And Liz, quickly give our listeners the website and the 800 number again before we get forced off the air by our advertisers.
Sure. I would really urge people to go to the Polaris Project. The Polaris Project is and their hotline is, the text line. Let's go to the text line first. It's DE3, B3, and that's 233-733. That's the text. And their hotline is 1-888-373-7888.
Okay, well, thank you, Liz. We've had a wonderful discussion here, and God bless you and all the work that you do, and we'll make sure we get you back on very soon.
Thank you, Dan. Right back at you. Bye-bye.